Less than a month after my husband was buried, his estranged son showed up at my house trembling and whispered, "The doctors said I may not survive the year." My daughter-in-law burst into tears. "Mom, you're all he has left." But the moment she stepped into my living room, I recognized the look in her eyes, not grief, but calculation. Then one night, I realized someone had been tampering with my medication. That was the moment I understood they weren't just after my husband's fortune. They wanted control over my entire life. Before we go further, I'm so grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I genuinely want to know who's in this room with me. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection and storytelling. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is worth your time. The day Arthur was buried, I told myself the hardest part was over. I was wrong. It had been exactly 31 days since I stood at Bonaventure Cemetery in the biting February wind, watching them lower the casket of the man I had spent 28 years of my life loving. 31 days of casseroles left on the porch, by neighbors, of sympathy cards stacked on the kitchen counter. I couldn't bring myself to open, of waking up at 3 in the morning and reaching across to his side of the bed before remembering. But grief, I had learned, does not arrive all at once. It waits. It lets you catch your breath just long enough to think you might survive it, and then it finds a new door to walk through. That afternoon, Daniel Price sat across from me in our living room on Abercorn Street, a slim leather briefcase open on the coffee table, a manila folder resting on top. Daniel had been Arthur's estate attorney for over 20 years. He was the kind of man who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday and remembered birthdays without being reminded. Arthur trusted him completely, and so I trusted him the way you trust anything your husband believed in without question. The room smelled like the jasmine climbing the side porch, the way it always did in late February, stubborn and sweet blooming before it was supposed to. The grand piano sat in the corner of the adjoining music room, its lid closed for the first time in years. I hadn't been able to open it since Arthur died. I wasn't sure I ever could again. My daughter Nora sat beside me on the sofa, her violin-calloused fingers wrapped around mine. She was 31 years old and had her father's eyes quiet and attentive, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and said nothing until they were ready. She hadn't cried once since the funeral. Neither had I. We were both holding something in the way you hold a breath underwater, waiting for the moment it was safe to surface. Vincent sat in the wingback chair across from us. I had not seen him in almost 4 years. Arthur's son from his first marriage, a fact that lived in our household the way a difficult piece of music lives in a student's fingers, always there, always slightly unresolved. Vincent was 39 now, broad-shouldered with the kind of jaw that photographs well. He had Arthur's height, but not his stillness. He sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, one arm draped over the side of the chair, as though this were a social call he was tolerating. His wife Celeste stood just behind his chair. She was younger than him by 4 years, dressed in a charcoal wrap dress that managed to look both respectful and expensive at the same time. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her hands rested lightly on the back of Vincent's chair, and she watched Daniel with the careful attention of someone who had already read the script and was waiting for the other actors to catch up. Daniel cleared his throat and began. I had not read Arthur's will before that day. Some people do. They review it together with their attorney, discuss every clause, prepare themselves. Arthur and I had talked about the broad strokes years ago over dinner in the easy way couples talk about things they expect to be far in the future. He had said, "I want to make sure you and Nora are taken care of. I want to make sure the house stays in the family. I want to make sure what we built together means something." What he had not said, at least not to me, was exactly how little of it would go to Vincent. Daniel's voice was measured and unhurried as he read through the document. The house on Abercorn Street, the music studio, the restoration business Arthur had built over 30 years dealing in antique and classical instruments, the majority of the estate held in trust was designated for me and for Nora. There were charitable bequests to a local music conservatory to Bonaventure's Preservation Society. And then Daniel reached the clause about Vincent. A lump sum cash distribution, specific and final. No stake in the business. No claim to the property. No seat at the table of anything Arthur had spent his life building. The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Vincent stood up. That's it. His voice was controlled, but only just the way a lid is controlled when something underneath is still boiling. Daniel looked up from the folder without expression. And that's it, Vincent said again, and this time the control cracked at the edges. After everything, after all the years I spent being kept at the outside of this family, that's the number he left me with. That's what I was worth to him. Vincent! Nora's voice was soft but firm. He didn't look at her. He was looking at Daniel and then at me. And there was something in his eyes I recognized immediately, because I had been a teacher for 35 years, and I had seen it in students who felt overlooked, the hot, specific anger of someone who had already decided they deserved more before they even walked in the room. Celeste moved from behind the chair to his side. She placed one hand on his arm, and with the other she pressed her fingers to her lips, and her eyes filled, slow swelling tears, the kind that looked beautiful rather than desperate. He worked so hard, she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, perfectly calibrated for the acoustics of grief. He tried so many times to have a real relationship with Arthur, and this is what he gets, after everything he sacrificed. I watched her face. The tears were real in the sense that they were wet, but her eyes, the skin around them, the small involuntary muscles that tighten when a person is actually crying, those were still, composed. Her eyes were dry in the way that eyes stay dry when the emotion is being performed rather than felt. I had been a piano teacher for 35 years. I knew the difference between a student playing the notes and a student playing the music. Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel said, turning to me, his tone shifting slightly, not warmer exactly, but more deliberate. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss the administrative details. Vincent picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. This isn't over, Eleanor. He said my name the way people say it when they mean something else. My father made a mistake, and I'm not going to just sit here and accept it. He walked out. The front door didn't slam it closed with a controlled, deliberate click that somehow felt louder. Celeste paused at the threshold of the room, dabbed at the corner of one eye with the pad of one finger. No mascara transferred, I noticed, and followed him without looking back. Nora exhaled slowly beside me. Her grip on my hand hadn't loosened. Daniel began closing the folder with the quiet efficiency of a man who had witnessed these moments before and understood that the kindest thing was to finish the paperwork. He snapped the briefcase closed, straightened his jacket, and extended his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss, Eleanor," he said. "Arthur was a remarkable man." "He was," I said. He was almost at the door when he paused. He turned back just slightly the way a person turns when they've remembered something they'd almost decided not to say. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was different now, lower, not consoling, careful. "Your husband was a very careful man." He held my gaze for one moment, then nodded once and walked out. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time after that, the jasmine coming through the window, the piano silent in the next room. Nora was saying something beside me, something about getting tea, about calling someone, but I wasn't listening. I was turning that sentence over in my mind. Your husband was a very careful man. It didn't sound like comfort. It didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like the first line of something, a piece of music you haven't heard before, but that your hands somehow already know. A week after the will reading, Vincent called. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, staring out at the back garden where Arthur's bird feeders still hung from the oak tree. He had filled them himself every Sunday morning. I hadn't been able to refill them. I kept telling myself I would get to it. I kept not getting to it. The number on the screen was Vincent's. I stared at it for 2 full rings before I picked up. Eleanor. His voice was quieter than it had been at the will reading. Thinner, somehow. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know this isn't a good time." "It's all right," I said, "because that is what you say." "There's something I need to show you, something about my health." A pause carefully placed. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. I told him I would come. Nora was at my kitchen table when I hung up grading sheet music for her students at the Savannah College of Art and Design. She looked up. I told her about the call. She set down her red pen. "I'm coming with you," she said, not a question. The clinic Vincent had chosen was on the south side of Savannah, a small private practice off Skidaway Road, the kind of building that looked like a converted Victorian house, with white trim and a brass nameplate by the door. Inside, it was quiet. Almost too quiet for a medical practice on a Thursday afternoon. One receptionist, no other patients in the waiting area. The magazines on the side table were 6 months old, which meant nothing on its own, but I noticed it, the way I notice when a student is holding their wrist wrong before they've even played a single note. Vincent was already there, seated in the corner of the waiting room with Celeste beside him. He stood when we came in, and I noticed he moved carefully, one hand briefly touching the armrest for balance, as though steadying himself. Whether that was genuine or rehearsed, I couldn't tell yet. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I mean it, Eleanor." The doctor came out shortly after. His name was Dr. Marcus Webb, a man in his mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and an air of careful authority. He shook my hand, showed us into a consultation room, and opened a folder on the desk with the practiced ease of someone who has delivered difficult news many times. "Mr. Hale has been diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition." Dr. Webb began, his voice low and unhurried. "It's rare, affecting roughly 1 in every 400,000 adults. The deterioration is gradual at first, but without early intervention, the prognosis becomes significantly more complicated." He turned a laptop toward us, showing what he said was Vincent's MRI scan. Areas of the brain highlighted in orange. Medical terminology I recognized in pieces, but not as a whole. He spoke for several minutes about experimental treatment protocols, about a specialist program in Atlanta that had shown promising results. The cost of the full treatment course, Dr. Webb said, is approximately $280,000. Insurance does not cover experimental protocols at this stage. I was watching him as he spoke. He was good. His delivery was measured, his posture appropriately grave. But twice when I asked a direct question, once about the name of the specific condition, once about the Atlanta specialist's published research, his eyes moved to Celeste before they moved back to me. It was less than a second each time, the kind of glance a student gives toward their sheet music when they're not sure of the next note. Celeste answered both times before Dr. Webb could finish forming his response. "The specialist's name is difficult to pronounce," she said smoothly the first time. "We can send you the documentation." She touched Vincent's arm. "He's been through so much already just getting this diagnosis. We didn't want to overwhelm you with paperwork today." On the drive back, Nora sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then she said, "He never made eye contact with you. Not once, Mom. Not for any real answer." "I noticed," I said. "What are you going to do?" I kept my eyes on the road. The Spanish moss hung low over Victory Drive, gray-green and heavy, with the late afternoon humidity. Savannah in early March looks like a city perpetually on the edge of a secret, beautiful on the surface, tangled underneath. I had lived here long enough to know you don't pull at Spanish moss. You just learn to read it. "I'm going to have dinner with them," I said. Nora turned to look at me. "Why?" "Because the best way to understand what someone wants from you is to let them ask for it themselves." That evening, Vincent and Celeste came to the house on Abercorn Street. I made the kind of dinner Arthur would have called a peace offering: roast chicken, biscuits, sweet tea. Celeste brought flowers. She arranged them in a vase on the sideboard without being asked, the way a person arranges things in a home they are already imagining as their own. We sat at the dining room table. Vincent ate sparingly, which I noted. Celeste ate with good appetite, which I also noted. After dessert, when the conversation had softened into something that almost resembled a normal family dinner, Celeste reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "He's gonna die, Eleanor." Her voice broke on the last word with surgical precision. "And you're the only one who can help him. Arthur would have wanted that. You know he would have." There it was. Arthur's name placed into the sentence like a key into a lock. I thought of something Arthur had said to me years ago on a quiet Sunday evening after a particularly difficult phone call with Vincent about money. We'd been sitting on the back porch, and Arthur had turned his sweet tea glass slowly in his hands and said, "Vincent always finds a way to make you feel like the villain Ellie, even when you're the one being wronged." I had thought at the time that he was being uncharitable. Now, sitting across from Celeste's perfectly timed tears and Vincent's carefully rationed bites of roast chicken, I turned that memory over like a coin I'd forgotten I was carrying. "I need some time to think," I said. "That's all I can promise right now." Celeste smiled. Vincent nodded slowly with the practiced gratitude of a man who had already decided the answer would be yes. After they left, I washed the dishes alone. The house was quiet. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and reached for my evening medication on the counter, the small amber bottle I kept in the same spot every single day left of the dish rack beside the salt. It was on the right side of the rack tonight. I stood there holding it for a moment. I set it back down. I told myself I had moved it earlier and forgotten. I told myself I was tired, that grief does strange things to routine, that it meant nothing. But I had been placing that bottle in the same spot for 11 years, and I did not forget things like that. Not yet, anyway. The first strange morning happened on a Tuesday. I woke up in the music room, not in bed, not on the sofa where I sometimes fell asleep reading, but standing at the piano bench, my hand resting on the closed lid of the grand piano, the room dark except for the gray early light coming through the plantation shutters. The clock on the mantel read 4:52. I was wearing my robe. My feet were bare on the cold hardwood floor. I stood there for a long moment trying to reconstruct the night. I remembered taking my medication after dinner. I remembered watching the evening news, then turning it off because I couldn't concentrate. I remembered going to bed. I did not remember walking to the music room. I did not remember touching the piano. I told myself it was grief. Grief does strange things to the body, everyone said so. Arthur had died in this house, and this was his room as much as mine, and it made a certain sad sense that some part of me would sleepwalk toward the last place I felt close to him. I made coffee and did not tell anyone. The second time it happened was the following Thursday. The third time was a Sunday. By the third week of March, my hands had begun to tremble in the mornings, a fine, shallow tremor, barely visible, but I felt it in my fingers when I sat down to practice. I had been playing piano since I was 6 years old. My hands had never betrayed me like that. I started making mistakes in passages I had known by heart for decades. I missed a lesson appointment with one of my students and only realized it when the student's mother called her voice careful and kind in the way people are careful and kind when they suspect something is wrong but don't want to say it directly. I rescheduled. I apologized. I told her I had simply lost track of the date. It was around that time that Miriam Cole came to visit. Miriam had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years. We had met when she was still the principal of the Savannah Academy of Music and Arts the year I joined the faculty. She was 67 now, retired, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of a woman who had spent decades telling teenagers to sit up straight. She had been at Arthur's funeral in the front row without being asked, had brought groceries twice in the first week without announcing herself, and had said almost nothing about grief because she understood the way only certain people understand that the kindest thing you can do for a mourning person is simply to remain present without filling the silence with words. She came on a Wednesday afternoon, let herself in with the spare key she had carried for 15 years, and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Ellie. She set a paper bag on the counter and looked at me the way she used to look at students who weren't practicing enough direct and without judgment, which somehow made it worse. "You don't look like yourself." "I'm tired," I said. "You're more than tired." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "Are you sleeping on and off?" "Eating." "Enough." She studied me for a moment. "How are your hands?" I looked down at them wrapped around the cold teacup. "They shake a little in the mornings." Miriam said nothing. She got up, put the kettle on, and began unpacking the paper bag fresh bread soup she had made herself a container of the lemon cookies I had loved since the first Christmas we spent as neighbors. She moved around my kitchen with the ease of someone who had been in it 100 times, and I watched her and felt for a moment almost normal. Vincent and Celeste had been coming by twice a week since the dinner. Each visit followed the same pattern. They arrived with something flowers, once a pie from a bakery on Broughton Street, a get-well card for me that I found faintly unsettling given that I wasn't sick. Vincent always sat in Arthur's chair without being invited to, and Celeste always moved through the rooms, slowly as though she were memorizing the layout. She complimented the furniture. She asked questions about the piano, how old it was, where Arthur had acquired it, whether it had been appraised recently. I answered her questions the way I used to answer students who asked things that weren't really about music, carefully giving nothing away, waiting to understand what they were actually asking. What I did not know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that during those visits, Celeste was recording. She held her phone loosely in her hand, angled at her side, the screen dark. I know this now. Then I only saw a woman who checked her phone frequently, which I had attributed to habit. Twice she positioned herself near the doorway of the music room when I was at the piano, and I had thought she was simply watching. I was wrong about what she was watching for. She was watching for the tremor in my hands. She was watching for the moments I paused mid-sentence, trying to remember a word. She was watching for every small thing that could be clipped into a 2-minute video and labeled as evidence. On the third Wednesday of March, Noah Bennett arrived for his piano lesson 45 minutes early and found me sitting on the porch steps with no memory of having gone outside. Noah was 17, quiet in the way of teenagers who observe more than they speak. He had been my student for 4 years. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his backpack over one shoulder and looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard not to be worried. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you okay? Our lesson isn't until 4. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15. I had no memory of the last hour and a half. I must have lost track of the time, I said, standing carefully. "Come on in, Noah." He followed me inside without saying anything else, but I felt his eyes on my back as we walked down the hall, and I felt the particular discomfort of being watched by someone who cares about you and doesn't know how to say so. That evening, Miriam came back. She walked into the kitchen, picked up the amber prescription bottle from the counter without a word, and turned it over in her hands. She read the label. She set it back down. She did not say anything, but her expression changed. It shifted in a way I had never seen on Miriam's face in 30 years of friendship, something behind her eyes that was careful and still and pointed inward the way a person looks when they have just understood something they wish they hadn't. "Miriam," I said, "what is it?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled a small, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach the careful place in her eyes. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just glad I came by." She left an hour later. I stood at the sink after she drove away, watching the oak tree in the back garden sway in the evening wind, the empty bird feeders turning slowly on their hooks. Something was wrong. I had known it since the Tuesday I woke up at the piano. But it wasn't until I saw Miriam's face in that kitchen that the knowing sharpened into something I could no longer push aside. I just didn't yet understand what I was supposed to do with it. The knock came on a Thursday morning, sharp and impatient the way June Whitaker always knocked. I had lived next door to June for 19 years. She was 72, a retired school teacher from Beaufort who had moved to Savannah after her husband passed and had spent the years since then tending an immaculate garden, watching far too much cable news, and maintaining a running commentary on every vehicle that parked on our block after 9 in the evening. She was, by most measurements, the most reliably observant person I had ever known. She noticed things the way other people breathed automatically without effort and with considerable detail. I opened the door, still holding my coffee. "I need to show you something," June said. She was wearing her cream cardigan, the one with the small tortoiseshell buttons, and she had her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in a way that meant she had been at her computer before she walked over. She was not carrying anything except her phone, which she held with both hands, screen facing inward the way people hold things they're not sure they should be sharing. "Come in," I said. She followed me to the kitchen table and sat down without waiting to be asked, which was typical of June. She placed the phone between us and turned it face up. "My doorbell camera," she said. "It automatically saves footage to a cloud account. I was going back through it last night. I couldn't sleep, you know how I get, and I found this." She pressed play. The footage was timestamped 1:47 a.m., March 19th. The image was grainy in the way that night vision doorbell cameras always are. Everything rendered in pale gray tones, the shadows too dark, the light sources too bright. June's front path was empty. Then from the left side of the frame, a figure appeared. It was a person in dark clothing, a hooded jacket hood, drawn-up face, angled downward with deliberate consistency, as though whoever it was understood exactly where the camera was positioned. The figure moved with a certain unhurried steadiness along the edge of the sidewalk, paused briefly at the property line between June's yard and mine, then continued up my front path and out of frame. The footage ran for another 11 seconds, showing nothing but the empty path. Then the recording ended. June reached over and tapped the screen back to the beginning. "Watch the bag," she said. I watched. The figure carried a bag slung over the left shoulder, canvas material rectangular with a short strap rather than a long adjustable one. The bag sat close to the body, not dangling but held snug, the way someone carries something they don't want to swing freely. In the pale gray of the night vision footage, I could not make out the color, but the shape was familiar in a way I felt before I consciously recognized it. I had seen a bag like that before. Canvas rectangular, short-strapped, carried close on the left shoulder. I had seen Celeste Hale carry a bag exactly like that. I set down my coffee cup. "You said March 19th, I said. 1:47 in the morning. June confirmed. March 19th was a Wednesday. 3 days after Vincent and Celeste had come to dinner. 3 days after Celeste had stood in my kitchen and used Arthur's name like a lever, pressing it gently but firmly until she found the right amount of give. He would hate to see this family torn apart, Eleanor. I had asked them to leave by 9:30, and Celeste had embraced me at the door with both arms, her chin resting briefly on my shoulder, the embrace of a woman performing warmth for an audience that was not there. I looked at the footage again. "Did your camera catch any other angles?" I asked. "No," June said. "It only faces my front path, but your front door would have been just to the right of frame, maybe 8-10 feet. She paused. "Eleanor, what is going on?" I did not answer her directly. I have known June long enough to understand that she asks questions she already suspects the answers to, and that what she wants is not information so much as confirmation that her instincts are sound. I told her that I wasn't sure yet, which was honest enough, and I asked if she could send me a copy of the footage. She sent it to my email from her phone before she finished her coffee. After she left, I stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment and looked at the hallway that led to the bedroom, where my prescription bottles sat lined up on the nightstand the way they had for the past 3 years. 2 medications, both clearly labeled, both from the Skidaway Road pharmacy that Vincent had recommended at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, an offhand suggestion, the kind that seems like nothing at the time. I had not thought about that recommendation since the day I'd transferred my prescriptions. Why would I have Vincent had said the parking was easier, that it was closer to my route home from school? I had agreed because it was true. I thought about it now. I went to the bedroom and picked up the amber bottle from the nightstand. The label read what it had always read my name, the prescription, the dosage, the refill date. I shook it once. The pills inside sounded the same as they always had, a soft plastic rattle, nothing unusual. But I thought about the mornings I had woken on the piano bench, the tremor in my right hand that had started in February and come and gone without explanation. The afternoon 3 weeks ago, when I had lost 40 minutes and could not account for them, I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the next thing I knew, the tea was cold, and the light through the window had shifted an hour to the west. I thought about all of it, and I looked at the bottle, and I thought, what if the label is the only thing that hasn't changed? I called Dr. Helena Brooks at 11 that morning. Helena and I had known each other for 14 years since her practice had taken over the patient list of my previous physician who'd retired. She was 58 precise, in the way that good doctors are precise, and she had the quality rare and worth more than most people understand of listening to what you actually said rather than what she expected you to say. "I need a favor," I told her, "and I need you not to ask me too many questions yet." A brief pause. "All right," she said. "I want you to have the pills in my evening prescription bottle tested, not by the pharmacy, independently. I want to know if what's inside them matches what's on the label." Another pause longer this time. "Eleanor, has something happened?" "I think something may have been happening for a while," I said. "I just haven't had the right angle on it until this morning." She agreed to come by the house that afternoon. I placed the amber bottle in a small Ziploc bag. I had seen enough procedural television over the years to understand the value of not handling evidence unnecessarily, which was a thought that felt simultaneously practical and surreal, and left it on the kitchen counter. Helena arrived at 2 o'clock, took the bag without opening it, and told me she would call as soon as she had anything. She had a contact at the university pharmacology department, she said. Someone discreet. It would take a day, perhaps 2. That evening, I sat with June's footage open on my laptop and watched it 4 more times. The bag, the left shoulder, the deliberate downward angle of the head, careful and consistent the whole length of the path. I could not prove it was Celeste. The figure was hooded. The footage was gray and grainy. No face, no distinguishing features beyond the shape of a canvas bag and the practiced way the person moved. I had seen enough of the world to know that a resemblance is not a fact, and that certainty built on resemblance is not certainty at all. It is only a feeling wearing certainty's clothes. But I had lived with Arthur for 31 years. He had been a patient man, a methodical man, a man who had once told me early in our marriage that the difference between knowing something and being able to act on it was the distance between a feeling and a document. "Get the document," he used to say. "Everything else is just noise." I was beginning to understand what he had meant. I forwarded the footage to my email a second time, then saved a copy onto a USB drive I found in the desk drawer. I labeled it in black marker, June camera, March 19th, 1:47 a.m., and put it in the inner pocket of my winter coat, which was hanging in the hall closet behind 2 lighter jackets, and a scarf I hadn't worn since January. My phone rang at 8:47 that evening, Helena's name on the screen. I answered before the second ring. "Eleanor," she said, and the particular weight in her voice, careful, measured the voice of someone selecting words the way a surgeon selects instruments, told me everything before she said the rest of it. I heard back from Patricia Sims. She ran a preliminary analysis this afternoon. I waited. "What's in this bottle?" Helena said, "is not what's on the label." The words stayed on the line long after Helena had hung up. "What's in this bottle is not what's on the label." I set the phone down on the kitchen counter very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you are afraid might shatter if it touches anything too hard. Outside, the magnolia tree in the side yard was starting to bloom, thick white petals, opening in the warm April air, indifferent to everything happening inside my house. I had stood at that window 1,000 times over 31 years. That morning, for the first time, the view felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I called Helena back within 2 minutes. "Tell me exactly what you found," I said. She took a breath. "Eleanor, I want to be careful here because I'm not a toxicologist, but I had the pills tested at the university lab. I know someone in the pharmacology department, Dr. Patricia Sims. She ran a basic compound analysis. The pills in that amber bottle do not match the label. Your prescription calls for a low-dose blood pressure medication, generic lisinopril. What's actually in those capsules is a sedative compound, not dangerous in small doses, but cumulative. Taken nightly over weeks, it would explain the disorientation, the sleepwalking, the tremors." I gripped the edge of the counter. "How long?" "Based on what you described, the symptoms starting in late February, possibly 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. February through March." The same weeks, I had been waking on the piano bench, losing track of conversations, dropping a coffee mug on the kitchen tiles, and not understanding why my hands would not cooperate. I had blamed grief. I had blamed age. I had blamed Arthur's absence from the chair at the breakfast table. "Helena," I said, "who could have done this?" "That's not a question I can answer," she said quietly. "But Eleanor, I need you to listen to me. Do not take another pill from that bottle. I'm going to hold on to it. Patricia is willing to write a formal analysis report, but she'll need a few days. In the meantime, you need your actual prescription refilled through a different pharmacy. And you need to tell someone." "I'll tell Nora," I said. "Good, tell her today." I did not tell Nora that morning. I know how that sounds. I know a sensible woman would have picked up the phone immediately, called her daughter, said, "Come over right now, something has happened." But I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, and I thought about what I knew and what I could prove, and I understood that those were two very different things. What I knew, someone had replaced my medication with a sedative. Someone had been inside my house. The doorbell footage June had given me showed a hooded figure at 1:47 in the morning. Someone wanted me confused, unsteady, easy to manage. What I could prove: a pill bottle with the wrong contents and a pharmacy label that did not match. That was it. That was the sum of it. If I went to Nora with that and said, "I believe Vincent and Celeste are doing this," she would ask me how I knew, and I would have to say I didn't know for certain. And Nora, my careful, methodical daughter, who had once spent 40 minutes reading the fine print of a home warranty contract, would want certainty before she believed the worst of her half-brother. So I waited. I made a pot of coffee I didn't drink. I sat in Arthur's chair, which I almost never did, and I looked at the music room from across the hall. The piano was quiet. By noon, I had made 3 decisions. The first, I would get my real prescription refilled at the CVS on Abercorn Street, not the pharmacy on Skidaway Road I had used for the past 4 years, the one that Vincent had once recommended to me offhandedly 2 years ago at Thanksgiving. I did not think about that coincidence too hard. I simply filed it. The second, I would not confront Vincent or Celeste. Not yet. Any confrontation now would only alert them, and they would have days, possibly weeks, to cover their tracks before I had enough to show anyone who mattered. The third, I would call Daniel Price. Daniel had been Arthur's attorney for 11 years. He had sat across from me at the will, reading 3 weeks ago, and I had watched him choose every word with the precision of someone who already knew much more than he was saying. He had handed me the envelope with both hands like a formal offering. "Your husband was a very careful man," he had said. I had turned that sentence over in my mind at least a dozen times since February. That morning, it finally felt less like a comfort and more like a warning. I left Daniel a voicemail. I kept it brief. "This is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to speak with you privately, not at your office somewhere quiet. Please call me back today." He called back within the hour, and we agreed to meet the following morning at a small cafe on Bull Street, the kind of place where the tables are far enough apart that a private conversation stays private. That afternoon, I finally called Nora. She arrived at 4 o'clock in a light blue jacket she'd had since graduate school. Her dark hair pulled back her expression, already braced the way it had been since the will reading, since the night she'd sat across from Vincent and watched him pocket his check and walk out without a word to either of us. I told her about the pills. I told her about Helena's call. I showed her the doorbell footage June had given me, the grainy image of the hooded figure the canvas bag slung on the left shoulder. Nora watched the footage twice. Then she looked at me with the expression she'd had at 12 years old when she'd realized the world was not always fair, clear-eyed, quietly furious, and entirely composed. "How long has this been going on?" she said. "Since at least February," I said. "Possibly longer." She was quiet for a moment. "And you think it's Celeste?" "I think it's both of them," I said, "but I can't prove it yet." "Then we build the proof," Nora said. It was, I thought, exactly what Arthur would have said. The thought made my chest tighten in a way I had learned to breathe through. We talked for 2 hours. Nora wanted to go to the police immediately. I asked her to wait until I had spoken with Daniel. We compromised 48 hours. If Daniel gave me nothing useful, we would file a report together. She left at 6:30, walking to her car with the careful, unhurried step of someone who was far angrier than she appeared. I stood in the doorway and watched until her taillights disappeared at the end of Abercorn Street. I went back inside and sat at the piano. I did not play. I rested my hands on the keys, just the weight of them, the familiar pressure of ivory under my fingers, and I thought about what Helena had told me, and what the footage had shown, and what Arthur's lawyer had said 3 weeks ago at the reading of a will that had apparently been only the beginning of a much longer story. Your husband was a very careful man. My phone buzzed on the piano lid, a text message unknown number. Mrs. Whitmore Arthur asked me to reach out to you when the time was right. My name is Elias Bennett. I tune pianos. I believe I need to pay yours a visit. I read the message 3 times. Then I set the phone down and looked at the keys beneath my hands, and for the first time since February, I felt something that was not grief and not fear. It was the specific quiet alertness of a woman who understands that the story she thought she was living is not in fact the whole story. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a leather tool case and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 50 years doing work that required patience. Elias Bennett was 70 years old with broad hands that moved with surprising delicacy and eyes that took in a room the way experienced craftsmen always do, not looking at what was decorative, but at what was structural. He wore a plain gray shirt and work trousers, and he stood on my porch with his tool case at his side as though he tuned pianos in this neighborhood every Tuesday, which for all I knew he did. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." I had called him back the morning after his text, and we had spoken briefly long enough for me to understand that he was not someone who would explain himself over the phone, and that whatever Arthur had trusted him with, he'd kept it without complaint for the better part of a year. I brought him to the music room. He set his case down and stood in front of the grand piano for a long moment before he touched it, the way you stand in front of something you have worked on many times and still respect. The piano was a 1962 Steinway Model B dark walnut, one of the pieces Arthur had spent the better part of a decade sourcing and restoring. It was the most valuable thing in the house, and not because of what it was worth on paper. Arthur came to me 14 months before he passed. Elias said, his voice measured and low. He called the shop himself, which he almost never did. Arthur usually sent an email, but that day he called. He said he needed me to do something that wasn't in my standard catalog of services. I sat down on the bench without thinking the way I always sat when someone told me something I needed to hear with my full attention. He said he needed a hidden compartment built into this piano. Elias continued, something that couldn't be found by anyone who didn't already know it was there. Not under the lid, not in any of the obvious places. He wanted it inside the keybed frame beneath the action mechanism behind the front rail. He paused. It took me 3 sessions over 2 weeks to do it properly without affecting the sound. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Arthur passed less than 2 months ago. Why wait until April?" Elias looked at me directly. "Because Arthur told me not to come until there was a reason to come." His exact words were, "Elias, if my son ever comes back trying to take control of Eleanor or what I've left her, that's when she needs to know." I heard about the will dispute through a mutual acquaintance. I gave it another few weeks to be certain it was as serious as it sounded. He paused. "It was." I looked at the piano. 28 years I had played this instrument. I had taught students on it, practiced on it at midnight when I couldn't sleep, played it the morning of our wedding anniversary every year, because Arthur liked to hear music before the day officially began. I had sat beside it at 4:52 in the morning without knowing why my feet had carried me there. "How does it open?" I asked. Elias crossed to the piano and indicated a section of the lower front panel, the decorative board that ran beneath the keyboard facing outward. To any observer, it looked like part of the original cabinet work. There's no button, no latch you can feel from the outside. The mechanism is triggered by a specific sequence of keys played in order. He looked at me. "Arthur designed the sequence himself. He said you would recognize it." He named the sequence 8 notes a pattern that moved up and back across 2 octaves in a rhythm that felt deliberate. I played it once in my mind before my hands moved to the keys. The moment I played it, I understood exactly where it came from. It was the opening phrase of the last piece Arthur had been writing when he died. The unfinished score still sitting on the music stand above the keyboard, exactly where he had left it. He was building the combination into the music while he was writing it. I said quietly. Elias nodded. He said, "If Ellie ever needs to find what's inside, she'll have to play her way to it. And she will, because she always does." I pressed my fingers to the keys and played the sequence slowly. From somewhere deep inside the piano's frame came a soft, deliberate sound, not a spring releasing, but something more like a drawer settling, and a section of the lower front panel shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. But it did not open fully. I pressed it gently. It held. "There's a second step," Elias said. "Arthur said the sequence alone was half the combination. The other half he gave to someone else. He said you would know who." I sat very still. Nora. Arthur had given Nora a 4-digit number on her 16th birthday, with no explanation beyond "you'll know when to use it." She had mentioned it once years ago, laughing about how her father made everything into a puzzle. I had laughed too, and forgotten it entirely. I had not forgotten it because I was losing my memory. I had forgotten it because I had never imagined I would need it. "There's one more thing," Elias said as he picked up his tool case to leave. "Arthur told me there are items inside, a drive, some documents, a recording." He paused at the door to the music room. He said, "Make sure Ellie knows whatever is in there will explain everything she hasn't been able to ask me directly." He left quietly the way he had arrived. I sat alone at the piano in the late afternoon light, one hand still resting on the keys. The front panel shifted just slightly out of place, close enough to open, not yet ready to give up what was inside. Arthur had been talking to me this whole time, through the music, through the silence, through the careful architecture of everything he had left behind. And somewhere in this piano was the rest of what he had needed to say. I just needed Nora to finish the sentence. The cafe on Bull Street had been there for longer than most of the buildings around it deserved credit for surviving. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow 3-story brick building, 2 blocks south of Forsyth Park, and it had the specific character of places that have never tried to be anything other than what they are: mismatched wooden chairs, a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed significantly in a decade, and tables spaced far enough apart that you could have a conversation without contributing it to the table beside you. I arrived 7 minutes early. I had not slept well. The message from Elias Bennett was still sitting on my phone. Arthur asked me to reach out when the time was right, and I had read it perhaps a dozen times since the previous evening, turning it over the way you turn over a sentence that means more than its words can hold. Arthur had known something was coming. He had prepared for it. He had hired a piano tuner to build a hidden compartment, and he had told that piano tuner to wait until the situation became dangerous before making contact. What I could not yet determine was how long Arthur had known and how much he had known, and why in 31 years of marriage he had never once said any of it to me directly. I ordered coffee I didn't need and sat with my back to the wall, which was something Arthur had always done in restaurants. Old habit, he used to say. I had never asked him what he was in the habit of watching for. Daniel Price arrived at 9 minutes past 9 carrying a leather briefcase that looked as though it had been with him since law school, and a paper cup of coffee from somewhere else, which told me he had been moving before this meeting. He was 53 trim with the slightly distracted precision of a man who keeps most of his attention on whatever problem he is currently solving. He shook my hand and sat down across from me and put the briefcase on the chair beside him rather than on the floor. "Thank you for meeting me here," I said. "I should have called you sooner," he said. It was not what I expected him to open with, and the directness of it. No preamble, no pleasantries, beyond the handshake, told me that whatever Daniel was about to say, he had been deciding how to say it for some time. "Tell me what you mean by that," I said. He wrapped both hands around his paper cup. "Arthur gave me instructions," he said. "Specific ones. He told me that if a dispute arose over the estate, or if you came to me with concerns before I came to you, I was to give you certain information that he did not want documented anywhere it could be accessed before the right moment." He paused. He was a precise man, Eleanor. Every instruction had a condition attached to it. The condition for this one was that the situation had to be serious enough to warrant it. "And you've decided it is," I said. "I decided it was," he said, "approximately 3 weeks ago." He opened the briefcase and removed a manila folder which he placed on the table between us, but did not open yet. "6 weeks ago, Daniel said a petition was filed in Chatham County Probate Court, a petition for temporary guardianship over your person and your finances on the grounds of alleged cognitive decline. The cafe noise continued around us, the low murmur of other conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the scrape of a chair, and I sat with that sentence for a moment before I trusted myself to respond. "Who filed it?" I said. It was not entirely a question. "Vincent Hale," Daniel said, "and Celeste Hale is co-petitioner." I had known in some part of myself I had not wanted to examine too closely that this was where things were heading. I had known it since Helena's phone call. I had known it since the doorbell footage, since the tremors, since the mornings I had woken somewhere I did not remember choosing to go. Knowing something is coming and hearing it stated plainly in a cafe on Bull Street are two different experiences, and I want to be honest about the fact that I felt the difference. "What grounds?" I said. Daniel opened the folder. He slid a single page across the table, a summary document, not the full filing. "The petition cites 3 items of supporting evidence," he said. "First, a video recording reportedly showing cognitive and motor impairment. Second, sworn statements from 2 individuals attesting to observed episodes of confusion and disorientation. Third, a letter from Dr. Marcus Webb, confirming a diagnosis of progressive neurological deterioration." I looked at the page. My name printed in the formal language of a legal document, followed by phrases I did not recognize as describing myself, inability to manage personal affairs, demonstrated pattern of impaired judgment, risk of financial exploitation. "The hearing date," Daniel said, "has been set for 4 weeks from today." I set the page back on the table. "And what does Georgia law say about the burden of proof in a guardianship petition?" Daniel looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, something between professional composure and something warmer. "It says the petitioner must demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence that the proposed ward lacks sufficient capacity to manage their own affairs. It is not an easy standard to meet." He paused. "But with a physician's letter and video evidence, a hearing will proceed regardless. A judge will want to see both sides." "Then both sides will be seen," I said. He reached into the briefcase again and removed a second item, a white envelope sealed with my name, written across the front in handwriting I recognized without needing to look twice. Arthur's handwriting, not Daniel's, not a paralegal's. Arthur's own hand, the deliberate cursive he had used for 31 years, always slightly wider on the capital letters than seemed strictly necessary. He had written Ellie on the envelope. Not Eleanor. Ellie, which was what he called me in private, which was what he had called me the morning he proposed in the kitchen of the apartment on Jones Street, holding a ring he had wrapped in a paper towel because he hadn't had time to find a box. I looked at Daniel. "When did he give this to you?" 14 months ago, Daniel said. "February of last year. He asked me to hold it until you needed it." He looked at me steadily. "I believe you need it now." I picked up the envelope and held it without opening it. The paper was slightly heavier than standard. Arthur had always preferred quality stationery, one of his small, consistent indulgences, and my name in his handwriting felt like being spoken to across a distance that could not be measured in any unit I knew. "I'd like to read this privately," I said. "Of course," Daniel said. He gathered the folder back into his briefcase and closed the latch. "Eleanor, I want you to understand something. Arthur did not come to me in February of last year because he was afraid. He came to me because he was thorough. There is a difference." He looked across the table with the particular steadiness of a man who means precisely what he says. "He believed you would be capable of handling whatever came. He simply wanted to make sure you had what you needed when it arrived. He could have told me himself, I said. I did not say it bitterly. I said it the way you state a fact that you have made your peace with and are now simply acknowledging out loud. He could have, Daniel said. I think he believed that telling you would have meant asking you to carry it before you had to, and he didn't want that for you. I thought about that. I thought about 31 years of a man who had kept his worry quiet, not because he was distant, but because he was careful, who had built contingencies into his life. The way other people left notes on refrigerators, small, unobtrusive, discoverable only when needed. What do I need to do? I said, in the next 4 weeks. Daniel set his cup down. 3 things, he said. First, we file a formal response to the guardianship petition. I'll handle that, but I need your full cooperation and documentation of everything you've gathered so far. Second, we establish independent medical testimony that contradicts Dr. Webb's letter. Third, he paused briefly. We need to understand who Celeste Hale is, not who she presents herself to be, who she actually is. I've already started on that, I said. He nodded as though this did not surprise him. Good. Then we have 4 weeks and a direction. He stood, picked up his briefcase. Call me tomorrow. We'll go through the details. He left without the kind of reassuring close that lawyers sometimes offer when they don't know what the outcome will be. I respected him for that. I sat at the table for another 10 minutes after he left the envelope in my hands, my coffee going cold beside me. The cafe moved around me, a couple near the window laughing at something on a phone, a young man in the corner, working at a laptop, the barista calling out a name I didn't catch. All of it ordinary. All of it happening in the same city where a petition had been filed in a probate court with my name on it, where someone had been in my house at 1:47 in the morning, where a bottle of medication had been carrying the wrong contents for 6 to 8 weeks, while I blamed everything it caused on grief. I turned the envelope over. Arthur's handwriting, Ellie. I did not open it there. I put it carefully inside my bag between my planner and my phone, and I walked back to my car on the quiet stretch of Bull Street with the steady step of a woman who has been handed the next part of a plan she did not know she was already inside. 4 weeks. I had 4 weeks a lawyer who was already on my side, a piano with a locked compartment I had not yet opened, and a letter from a man who had known 14 months before I did that this day was coming. I thought, walking back to my car in the April warmth, Arthur, you careful, impossible man. I thought it with something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but lived in the narrow space between the two. The house was quiet when I got home. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the first weeks after Arthur died, when silence had felt like something pressing against the walls from the outside. This was a different kind of quiet, purposeful, the kind that settles over a room when the person inside it is preparing to do something that cannot be undone. I went to the music room. I did not turn on the overhead light. I turned on the small lamp on the side table, the one with the amber shade that Arthur had picked up at an estate sale in Charleston 20 years ago because he said overhead light was the enemy of serious thought. I sat down on the piano bench with the envelope in my lap, and I held it for a moment before I opened it. The paper inside was 2 pages handwritten, both sides of each sheet, filled in Arthur's careful slanted script. He had always written the way he worked, methodically, with no wasted motion, every word placed where it was meant to be. I began to read. He started with an apology. Not for dying, Arthur would never have been so theatrical about something as unavoidable as that, but for the things he had carried alone and had never found the right moment to put down. He wrote, "There are things a man keeps to himself, not out of dishonesty, but out of a particular kind of love, the kind that believes it is protecting the people it cannot afford to lose." Then he told me about the trust. 12 years ago, when Vincent was 27 and making a series of financial decisions that Arthur had watched with growing alarm, Arthur had established a separate discretionary trust in Vincent's name, $3 million. It was funded, quietly structured, so that Vincent could draw from it over time rather than receive it as a lump sum Arthur had believed with the particular optimism of a father who wanted to be wrong about his son. That structure might encourage restraint. It had not. Vincent drew from the trust aggressively from the first year. By the time he was 31, the trust was depleted. Arthur did not tell me because he did not want me to feel that Vincent's choices were in any way a consequence of our marriage, of my presence in Arthur's life, of the family we had built, that Vincent had always stood slightly outside of. He wrote, "I know you, Ellie. I know you would have found a way to make his failures your fault. They were not. They were entirely his own." I set the letter down on my knee for a moment and looked at the piano. $3 million. Spent. And then, when it was gone, Vincent had come back not with humility, but with hunger, dressed up in a medical file and a grieving wife, and the borrowed language of a son who had been wronged. I picked the letter back up. Arthur wrote about Celeste. He had noticed her. He said the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar piece, not immediately, not with certainty, but with the particular unease of something that does not quite resolve. He had hired a private investigator 18 months before his death. What the investigator found was not conclusive, but it was directional. Celeste had lived in Tucson, Arizona until 2022. She had been closely associated with an elderly widower named Harold Marsh in the final years of his life. Harold Marsh had died in the spring of 2021. His family had raised questions about the circumstances of his estate that were never formally resolved. Arthur had written a name at the bottom of that paragraph, Lydia Voss. She was Celeste's closest friend in Tucson. She knows more than she has said publicly. Find her if you can, Ellie. She may be the thread that pulls the rest of it loose. Then near the end of the second page, he wrote about the piano. He confirmed what Elias had told me, the compartment, the sequence, the items inside. But he added something Elias had not known to tell me. The sequence alone opens the latch, but the latch is spring-loaded and will not release without the secondary code. I gave that code to Nora on her 16th birthday. She may not know why she has it. Tell her. She will understand when you explain it because she has always been smarter than either of us gave her credit for. He ended the letter simply. He wrote, "I have tried to build every wall I could around you and Nora before I had to leave. Some of those walls are legal, some are financial, some are in the form of people who owe me nothing but whom I trust completely, and one of them is inside a piano. I am sorry I could not simply be here instead, but since I cannot use everything, fight with everything, you were never as fragile as you thought you were, Ellie. You were only ever being careful. There is a difference, and I need you to know that I knew it even when you didn't." I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time. I did not cry. I had cried for Arthur in the dark and in private in the weeks after the funeral, when the casseroles were still coming and the cards were still arriving, and I had spent that grief the way you spend savings carefully, a little at a time, because you know it has to last. What I felt now was not grief. It was something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of hearing a piece of music you have always known but never understood until this precise moment. I folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on top of the piano. Then I sat down at the bench, placed my fingers on the keys, and played the sequence Elias had given me. 8 notes, deliberate and ascending. From somewhere inside the instrument came the soft mechanical sound I had heard before the latch, releasing the spring, engaging the compartment, waiting. It held, waiting for Nora's 4 digits to finish what Arthur had started. I reached for my phone. Before I could dial, I stopped. There was something else I needed to do first. Arthur had given me a name, Lydia Voss, Tucson, Arizona, the woman who knew more than she had said. If Celeste had done this before, if there was a pattern that predated our family entirely, then Lydia Voss was the thread that could prove it. I needed to find her before the hearing, and I had 4 weeks left to do it. Miriam found her in 4 days. I had expected it to take longer. Lydia Voss was not someone who advertised her whereabouts. Arthur's investigator had tracked her to Tucson, but his notes were 2 years old, and people who want distance from their past have a way of making themselves difficult to locate. But Miriam Cole had spent 30 years building a network of former colleagues, alumni, and community connections that stretched across the entire coastal South. And when she decided to find someone, she found them with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had once tracked down 17 missing library books in a single afternoon. Lydia had moved to Savannah in the spring of 2023. She was living in a rented apartment off Skidaway Road and working part-time at a framing shop near Forsyth Park. Miriam had learned this through a former colleague who knew Lydia's landlord, which was exactly the kind of connection that should not work but always does in a city the size of Savannah. I went alone. Miriam had offered to come, and I had said no. 2 women arriving together would feel like an ambush, and I needed Lydia to make her own choice about whether to talk, not feel cornered into it. The bar was small and dim, the kind of place that had been on the same corner for 40 years, without changing anything except the prices. Lydia was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a glass of red wine and the expression of someone who had been talked into something they hadn't yet decided was a good idea. She was 41 with dark circles under her eyes and the particular wariness of a person who had learned to be careful about strangers. She looked up when I sat down and said nothing, waiting for me to explain myself. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," I said. "I believe you knew a woman named Celeste in Tucson." Something moved across Lydia's face. Not surprise, more like the recognition of a thing she'd been expecting for longer than she wanted to admit. "Who told you about me?" she asked. "My husband. He hired someone to look into Celeste's background before he died. Your name came up." She turned her wine glass slowly on the table. "I don't want any trouble." "I'm not here to make trouble," I said. "I'm here because Celeste is doing to me what I believe she did to someone else. And I think you know what that looks like." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a group of tourists passed the window loud and unhurried, the sound of their laughter filtering through the glass like something from a different world. "Harold Marsh," she said finally, not a question. "Yes." She exhaled slowly. Harold was a good man. 72 years old, widower, no children. He had a house in the Catalina foothills and more money than he knew what to do with, and absolutely no reason to suspect that the woman who kept showing up with groceries and calling to check on him was anything other than kind. She paused. "Celeste was my friend then, or I thought she was. I introduced her to Harold at a neighborhood function in 2019. I thought I was doing something nice." "What happened?" "Over the next 2 years, she made herself indispensable to him. Drove him to appointments, managed his calendar, helped him with his finances. He gave her signing authority on one of his accounts because she told him it would be easier for her to help him that way." Lydia's voice was flat, but her grip on the wine glass had tightened. By 2020, he had updated his estate documents. His family didn't know until after he died in March of 2021. By the time they hired an attorney, Celeste was already gone. She had transferred out of Arizona within 3 weeks of Harold's funeral. I thought of the footage from June's camera, the figure moving through my side gate at 1:47 in the morning with the certainty of someone who already knew the layout. His family tried to contest the estate. I asked. They tried. They couldn't prove intent. Celeste had been careful everything was documented. Everything had Harold's signature on it. His doctor said he was competent when he signed. There was no paper trail that led anywhere useful. She finally let go of the wine glass. "She's very good at what she does, Mrs. Whitmore. She doesn't leave evidence. She leaves paperwork." The distinction settled over me like something cold. Not evidence. Paperwork. Documents that looked legitimate because the person who created them understood exactly what legitimate looked like. "She kept a folder," Lydia said abruptly, as though the words had been sitting at the back of her throat for a long time. "On Harold. On others, I don't know how many. She called it her insurance, said it was in case anyone ever tried to come after her. Receipts, correspondence photographs, things that would muddy the water if anyone looked too closely." She paused. "I don't know where it is now, but she never threw anything away. Celeste believed in keeping leverage." I looked at Lydia across the small table. She was frightened not of me, but of something older and more specific than this conversation. "Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" I asked. She shook her head immediately. "Not yet, I need to think about it." I did not push. I understood the arithmetic of fear. She had lived with this knowledge for 4 years and had said nothing, which meant she had reasons for her silence that a single conversation was not going to dissolve. I left her my number and stood to go. "Mrs. Whitmore." Her voice stopped me at the edge of the table. She kept that folder close, not in a bank or a storage unit somewhere she could get to it quickly. She looked at me steadily. "If you can find it, you won't need my statement. It'll say everything." I walked out into the warm Savannah evening and turned that information over in my mind all the way home. A folder somewhere accessible, somewhere Celeste felt safe. I thought about the figure moving through my side gate in the dark, unhurried and familiar, with a structured bag over her left shoulder. I thought I might know exactly where to start looking. Before I tell you what changed everything, pause for a second and comment the word "still here" so I know you're with me. Because what's coming next, Eleanor didn't see it coming either. A note before we continue: some details in this story are fictional shaped to carry a message worth hearing. If you'd prefer to step away now is a gentle moment to do so. The Thursday lesson started the way Thursday lessons always started. Noah Bennett arrived at 3:58, 2 minutes early, which was his habit. He was 17, slight-framed, with the particular posture of a teenager who had spent enough hours at a piano bench to understand the difference between sitting correctly and merely sitting. He wore a gray t-shirt and carried his music folder under one arm and said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," the way he always did, not as a greeting exactly, more as an acknowledgement that the session was beginning and both parties were present and accounted for. I had been teaching Noah for 4 years. I had watched him move from a hesitant 12-year-old who hit the keys like he was apologizing to them, to a young man who played with the kind of intuitive sensitivity that cannot be taught so much as recognized and carefully not ruined. His mother had called me in January to say he'd been accepted to audition for the Schwab School of Music at Columbus State. I had not told him I already knew because I had not wanted to take anything away from the moment he told me himself. He sat down at the piano. He opened the Chopin Nocturne, Opus 9 No. 2, which we had been working on for 3 weeks. He placed his hands on the keys and began. I stood to the left of the piano, arms crossed loosely, listening. Outside, the Savannah afternoon was warm and unhurried, the kind of May afternoon that makes you understand why people choose to live in the South, even when the South is difficult. The light came through the music room windows at a low angle and fell across the keys in long, pale strips. Noah played well. Better than last week, which was better than the week before. The opening phrase, the one that so many students rush because they are impatient to get to the melody, he took at exactly the right weight, each note settled and deliberate, the space between them as considered as the notes themselves. I did not interrupt. When a student is playing well, the most useful thing a teacher can do is be quiet. He finished the nocturne, lifted his hands from the keys, and sat with his back straight, and his eyes forward for a moment, in the way that musicians sometimes do, after a piece ends not quite in the room, yet still somewhere inside the music. "That was the best it's been," I said. He nodded, but he didn't move, and he didn't look at me, and I noticed because I notice things. Because 30 years of teaching have made attention a reflex, I cannot turn off that there was something else in the room besides the end of a well-played nocturne. "Noah," I said. He reached into the front pocket of his music folder and took out his phone. He held it for a moment without speaking. His hands were steady, which told me he had been deciding whether to do this for longer than the length of the lesson. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to understand that I didn't know what I was recording when I recorded it." I moved to the bench beside him and sat down. He opened his camera roll, scrolled back with the careful deliberateness of someone who had located the file many times already, and pressed play. The video was 43 seconds long. It had been shot from what I immediately recognized as a pocket angle, the camera pointing upward and outward from somewhere around knee height, the frame unsteady in the way of footage that no one intended to take. The image was slightly overexposed on one side, the audio uneven, the composition accidental, in every sense of the word. But the voices were clear. The first voice was Vincent's. I had known that voice for 31 years, not warmly, not with the particular ease of people who have chosen each other, but with the specific familiarity of people who have been adjacent to each other's lives long enough that certain things become impossible to mistake. His cadence, the slight flatness he carried in his vowels, the way he clipped the ends of sentences, as though he considered them unnecessary. The guardianship has to be approved before the hearing date. Webb's letter should be enough. If the court asks for a second opinion, we say she refused evaluation. A pause. Then the second voice, lower, more even, with the controlled quality of someone who thinks before they speak and chooses words with the care of someone who understands their weight. Celeste. The medication is still working. She had another episode last week, according to the neighbor. My chest tightened. The neighbor, Vincent said. Which neighbor? The old woman next door. She mentioned it to Marcus at the follow-up. A brief silence on the recording, 8, perhaps 9 seconds of ambient sound, the low hum of what might have been an air conditioning unit, the faint suggestion of traffic somewhere outside. Then Vincent again. And Nora. Celeste's voice without hesitation. Nora is the problem. Once Eleanor signs the financial authority paperwork, we deal with Nora separately. The recording ended. I sat with it for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. The music room was very quiet. Noah had not moved beside me. He was looking at the piano keys rather than at me, which I understood was a kind of courtesy, giving me somewhere to look other than at another person's face while I processed what I had just heard. Once Eleanor signs the financial authority paperwork, we deal with Nora separately. I had known in the abstract way that you know things when you have been gathering evidence for 2 months that Vincent and Celeste were not simply pursuing a guardianship petition out of misplaced concern for my well-being. I had known about the medication. I had known about the footage from June's camera. I had known about the $3 million trust that Daniel had hinted at and that Arthur's letter had not yet fully explained. I had known, in other words, that this was about money. But hearing Celeste say Nora's name in that voice, the flat transactional voice of someone cataloging a problem to be managed, moved the situation from something I understood intellectually into something I felt in a way that required a moment before I could speak. When was this recorded? I said. 3 weeks ago, Noah said. April 22nd. I was waiting outside the office on Drayton Street. I had a lesson with Mr. Hensley at 4, and I was early, so I sat on the bench outside. They came out of the building next door. I didn't know who they were. My phone was in my jacket pocket, and it must have started recording when I sat down the button catches sometimes. He paused. I didn't listen to it until last week. I was going through my camera roll, and I heard the voices, and I recognized... He stopped. I recognized your name. You recognized my name, I repeated. Yes, ma'am. I looked at the phone in his hand. 43 seconds. Accidental knee-height ambient audio recorded by a 17-year-old waiting for a piano lesson. And it contained 2 people explicitly discussing a guardianship timeline, confirmed medication tampering, and a plan to deal with Nora separately once financial authority had been transferred. I thought about what Daniel would say when I played it for him. I thought about what Aaron Vale, the name Daniel, had mentioned briefly at our last meeting. A detective in Savannah's Financial Crimes Unit would say when he heard Celeste's voice state the medication plan out loud. Noah. I said, I need to ask you to do something and I need you to take it seriously. He looked at me directly for the first time since he'd pressed play. Do not tell anyone you have this recording, I said. Not a friend, not your parents yet. Not anyone until I've spoken with my attorney. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, he said, and I believed him because in 4 years of lessons, I had never known Noah Bennett to say something he didn't mean. Send it to my email right now while you're sitting here. Then we'll talk about what comes next. He sent it. I watched the notification arrive on my phone. After Noah left carefully, quietly, with the slightly stunned expression of a young man who had walked into an ordinary Thursday and walked out carrying something considerably heavier, I sat for a long time at the piano. I did not play. I thought about Nora, who was across town right now in her apartment near the SCAD campus, probably marking papers or making dinner, entirely unaware that her name had been spoken in a specific tone by a woman she had never trusted, but had tried to be fair to on a recording now sitting in my email inbox. Deal with Nora separately. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "I have something you need to hear," I said. 43 seconds of audio. Vincent and Celeste, 3 weeks ago, Drayton Street. I paused. Daniel, they mentioned Nora by name. A beat of silence on the line. Then, "I'll clear my afternoon. Come in at 5. "One more thing," I said. "That detective you mentioned, Aaron Vale, financial crimes." "Yes," Daniel said. "I think it's time," I said. I ended the call and set the phone on the piano lid. Outside, the May afternoon continued its slow, warm progress toward evening, the kind of savannah evening that feels like it has no edges. Somewhere on the street, a car passed. A bird called once from the magnolia tree and then was quiet. I thought they made one mistake. They had been careful with the medication, careful with the petition, careful with the timing, but they had stepped outside an office on Drayton Street on an April afternoon and spoken out loud, and a 17-year-old boy had been sitting on a bench with a jacket and a phone that had a button that catches sometimes. Careful people, I thought, and sometimes even careful people forget to check the bench. The church smelled the way it always had, candle wax, old wood, and something floral I had never been able to identify in 30 years of occasional attendance. Father Michael Brennan was 63 with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades listening to things people could not say anywhere else. He had known Arthur since they were both in their 40s, bound by a shared appreciation for single malt scotch and the particular stubbornness of men who had grown up being told they were wrong about most things. He met me in the small side office off the nave, offered me tea. I declined and sat across from me with his hands folded on the desk. "I've been expecting you," he said. "Not today, specifically, but I knew you'd come eventually." "Then you know why I'm here." "I have a guess." He looked at me carefully. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I need to know everything Arthur told you. Not in confession, I know you can't speak to that, but as his friend—" Father Brennan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere on the church grounds, a distant, ordinary sound that had nothing to do with what was happening inside this room. "Arthur came to me 3 years ago," he said, finally. "Not to confess. He sat in that chair where you're sitting now, and he said he needed to talk to someone who would listen without trying to fix it." He paused. He was frightened, Eleanor. Not of dying Arthur had made a kind of peace with that. He was frightened of what he thought might happen after. Because of Vincent. Because of the woman around Vincent. Father Brennan said it carefully, the way you say something you have been holding at arm's length for a long time. He said, "There's someone in my son's life who I don't trust, and I don't know how to protect my family from someone I can't name a specific crime against yet." I thought of Celeste arranging my flowers without being asked, moving through my rooms with the quiet, proprietary ease of someone taking inventory. He said Vincent had always been difficult, Father Brennan continued. Angry in the unfocused way of a man who felt owed something he couldn't clearly define. But this was different. Arthur said Vincent had changed in the 2 years since Celeste came into his life, more calculating, more patient. Like someone had given direction to an energy that had previously just been destructive. "She aimed him," I said. Father Brennan looked at me. "That's almost exactly what Arthur said." He stood then and crossed to the small bookshelf behind his desk. He removed a slim white envelope from between 2 books and held it for a moment before he brought it to me. "A woman came here 6 months ago. She said her name was Evelyn Cross. She said she had known Arthur many years ago and that she needed to leave something for his wife in the event that anything ever went wrong with the estate." He set the envelope on the desk between us. "I didn't know whether to contact you. I decided to wait and see if you came to me first." I opened it at the desk right there because I had learned in the past 3 months that waiting to open things was a luxury I could no longer afford. Evelyn Cross wrote plainly without apology or excessive explanation. She had known Arthur before Eleanor, before Vincent's mother, before most of what had become his life. She wrote that Vincent's mother had used the boy as financial leverage against Arthur for years, small amounts consistent pressure, the kind of sustained extraction that never rises to the level of a formal complaint, but costs a person something essential over time. Arthur had paid, not because he was weak, but because he believed for longer than was reasonable that the payments would eventually buy his son a stable life. They had not. Then Evelyn wrote something that made me set the letter down for a moment. She wrote that Celeste had contacted her 8 months ago, out of nowhere, after years of no connection. Celeste had asked careful questions about Arthur's estate, about Eleanor, about Nora. She had framed it as concern. Evelyn had not believed a word of it. She wrote, "I don't know what she's planning, but she researched your family before she moved. Whatever is happening to you now, it did not begin recently." At the bottom of the page, Evelyn had written an email address and a single line, "If you need a witness to what Arthur told me about the money and about Vincent's mother, I will come. I owe him that much." I folded the letter along its creases and placed it in my bag. Father Brennan watched me from across the desk. "Is there anything else I can do?" "Not yet," I said, "but I may need you to be available when this goes in front of a court." He nodded once. "I'll be here." I walked back out through the nave, past the candles and the old wood smell into the late May heat of Savannah. The lawnmower had stopped. The street outside the church was quiet. Celeste had researched my family before she moved. Whatever is happening to you now, it did not begin recently. I had been thinking of this as something that started with Arthur's death. It hadn't. It had started long before I was even watching for it. Planned, researched, and set in motion by a woman who understood that the best time to begin dismantling something is before the people inside it realize they should be paying attention. Tomorrow I would meet Detective Aaron Vale. It was time to stop gathering pieces and start building something he could use. Daniel had arranged the meeting for 9 in the morning at a coffee shop on Congress Street, away from the police station and away from anywhere Vincent or Celeste might reasonably appear. Detective Aaron Vale was already there when I arrived. He was 45 medium build with the kind of face that gave nothing away by default, not unfriendly, simply neutral, in the practiced way of someone who had spent 20 years reading other people's expressions without offering his own in return. He wore a plain dark jacket and had a coffee in front of him he hadn't touched. He stood when I came in, shook my hand once, and sat back down. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Daniel tells me you have documentation." "I have several things," I said. "I'd like to hear what you have first." He looked at me for a moment, reassessing, I thought, the way people do when someone doesn't behave the way they expected. "Fair enough," he said. Vale worked financial crimes for Savannah PD. He told me he had been aware of Celeste Hale for 8 months, not because of anything connected to my family, but because of a series of small, irregular transfers from a joint account held by Vincent and Celeste into a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The LLC had no employees, no declared business activity, and had been opened 4 months before Arthur died. That kind of structure, Vale said, is sometimes legitimate. People set up holding companies for all kinds of reasons, but the timing, the size of the transfers, and the fact that the LLC's registered agent address is a mail forwarding service in Wilmington, that combination raised flags. "You've been watching them for 8 months, I said. "Why haven't you moved?" "Because what I had was circumstantial, a pattern, not a crime I could prove in front of a judge." He paused. "Until Daniel called me last week." He had reviewed what Daniel sent him, a summary of the guardianship petition, Helena's lab report on the medication, and the description of June's camera footage. He had not yet seen Noah's video. I took out my phone and played it for him across the table. The volume low, the 43 seconds of Vincent and Celeste's voices filling the narrow space between us. Vale listened without expression. When it ended, he was quiet for a moment. "The medication is working," he repeated quietly, not to me. To himself, the way investigators repeat things when they are placing them into a larger structure. "There's more," I said. I told him about Lydia Voss, about Harold Marsh in Tucson, about Celeste leaving Arizona 3 weeks after Harold's funeral. Vale listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, he opened the notebook he had kept closed on the table beside his coffee and wrote 3 lines. "Lydia Voss," he said. "She's here in Savannah. She is. She's not ready to make a formal statement yet, but she's close." "I know the Harold Marsh case," Vale said. "It came across my desk 8 months ago as part of background on Celeste. The family in Tucson never got traction because the paperwork was clean. No physical evidence of coercion, no witnesses willing to go on record." He looked up from his notebook. "What you're describing changes the picture. If Celeste ran the same playbook here, the medication, the video documentation, the guardianship petition, that's a pattern. And a pattern is something a prosecutor can work with." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "I need Celeste or Vincent to say something actionable, on record, something that goes beyond what's in a 43-second video of uncertain admissibility." He held my gaze. "Is there a way to make that happen?" I had been thinking about this since the night Noah showed me the video, since the moment I had stood in the music room and understood that waiting for them to make a mistake was no longer a viable strategy, not with Nora in the equation, not with a hearing date moving toward me like a fixed point on a calendar. "Yes," I said, "I can make that happen." Vale studied me with the same neutral expression he had worn since I sat down. Then something in it shifted fractionally, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. "You have a plan," he said. It was not a question. "I have the beginning of one. I need 2 weeks to put the rest in place." He nodded once. "Then let's talk about what admissible looks like." We stayed another 40 minutes. When I stood to leave, Vale remained seated. "One more thing, Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was even but careful in the way it gets when the information is significant. "Vincent filed an amended motion yesterday. The guardianship hearing has been moved up." He looked at me directly. "You have less than 3 weeks." 3 weeks. I walked out onto Congress Street into the June heat and did not break stride. 3 weeks was not much, but it was enough if I moved quickly and made no mistakes. I had not come this far by making mistakes. I called Vincent on a Tuesday morning and made sure my voice sounded tired. It was not entirely an act. 3 months of grief layered over 3 months of fear, layered over the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting a war no one else could see that was real enough. I simply let it sit closer to the surface than usual. "Vincent," I said, "I've been thinking about everything. I wonder if I've been approaching this the wrong way." A pause. "Could you and Celeste come by Thursday evening? I'd like to talk." He agreed before I finished the sentence. I spent the next 2 days preparing the music room. Not in any visible way, nothing that would signal to Vincent or Celeste that anything had changed. The room looked exactly as it always did, the Steinway in the corner. Arthur's framed compositions on the wall, the small side table with the amber lamp sheet music stacked in the order I had always kept it. The only difference was the metronome on the piano's edge, a mahogany Seth Thomas model Arthur had bought in 1987, which I had owned for so long it had become invisible in the room the way familiar things do. I opened it the night before. The internal mechanism left just enough space beside the pendulum housing for a small digital recorder. I tested it twice, confirmed the audio quality from across the room, and closed the case. I called Daniel. I called Helena. I called Miriam. I gave them each a specific instruction and a specific position. Vale would be nearby with a colleague available if needed. None of them would be visible. None of them would come inside unless I sent a message that said one word now. Thursday evening arrived warm and still, the kind of June night in Savannah that smells like gardenias and cut grass and holds the heat long after the sun is gone. Vincent and Celeste came at 7 o'clock precisely. Celeste brought hydrangeas blue and white arranged already in a paper sleeve. She handed them to me at the door, with a smile that had not changed in 4 months, warm, practiced a few degrees short of genuine. Vincent had dressed carefully. He looked rested in a way that people look rested when things are going the way they planned. I brought them to the music room. "Arthur and I always talked through the important things in here," I said, settling into the chair beside the fireplace. It seemed right. Vincent sat on the small sofa across from me. Celeste took the chair nearest the door closest to the exit I noted, which was either habit or instinct. "I've been thinking about what you said." I began keeping my voice soft and slightly unfocused the way it had sounded on the days the medication had been working. About Arthur wanting what was fair. About family. I looked at Vincent. Maybe I've been too rigid about all of this. Vincent leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, that means a great deal to hear. I just need to know one thing before I consider signing anything." I looked at him directly. "I need to know that Nora will be left alone through this process, that whatever arrangement we come to, she's not affected." A brief exchange of glances between them, quick, involuntary, the kind that happens when two people have discussed a subject enough times that a single look carries a full conversation. "Of course," Celeste said smoothly. "Nora isn't part of any of this. We only want what's fair for Vincent." "She's right," Vincent said. "This is between us, Eleanor. That's all it's ever been." I nodded slowly as though this reassured me. Then I said, "Sometimes I wonder if things would have been simpler if I'd never been in the picture at all, if things had been different from the beginning." I watched Vincent's face. There it was, the thing that lives underneath the performance, the real feeling that all the careful management in the world cannot entirely suppress when someone hands it an opening. His expression shifted just slightly in the way that expressions shift when a person stops calculating and starts feeling. Honestly. His voice was quieter now, more unguarded. It would have been. If you'd gone before Arthur, none of this would have been necessary. The room was absolutely silent. Celeste's hand moved toward Vincent's arm, the same corrective gesture she had used at the will reading 4 months ago, when he had said too much in front of Daniel. But this time, it was too late by several seconds. I looked at Vincent steadily. I kept my face exactly where it was. "Yeah, thank you, Vincent," I said. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." Something changed in his eyes then. A flicker of recalculation the moment a person realizes the ground beneath them has shifted without their noticing. He looked around the room slowly, the lamp, the sheet music, the fireplace, the piano. His gaze stopped at the metronome. 1 second, maybe less. Then he looked back at me and smiled, and the smile was the same as always, except that the confidence in it had developed a hairline fracture that had not been there when he walked in. "So," he said carefully, "when would you like to discuss the paperwork?" "Soon," I said, "very soon." Vincent and Celeste's headlights disappeared down Abercorn Street at 8:32. I watched from the front window until the street was dark again. Then I picked up my phone and called Nora. "It's time," I said. "Come home." She arrived 40 minutes later. She came through the door with a bag over her shoulder and looked at me the way she had been looking at me for months, searching for the version of her mother she remembered checking to see if she was still there. I took her face in both hands for a moment the way I had when she was small. "I'm all right," I said. "Better than I've been. Come." Elias was already in the music room. He stood beside the Steinway with his hands at his sides, patient as always. When Nora walked in, he introduced himself in 3 sentences, his name, his trade, and the fact that her father had trusted him with a secret for 14 months. Nora looked at the piano. He really built something inside it. "Behind the front rail beneath the key bed," Elias said. 2 sessions 3 weeks apart. He said put it where everyone already looks because that's the last place anyone will think to search. I sat at the bench and placed my hands on the keys. The 8-note sequence came without effort. Arthur had written it into the unfinished score on the music stand, and I had played it enough times now that my hands moved before my mind caught up. The notes rose and fell across 2 octaves, and from inside the piano's frame came the soft mechanical response I had heard before the latch, engaging, holding, waiting. I looked at Nora. She crossed to the piano without being asked and crouched beside the lower front panel. She rested her hand on the walnut surface for a moment. "He gave me the number on my 16th birthday," she said quietly. "We were on the back porch after dinner. He said, 'Remember this. You'll know when your mother needs it.'" She paused. I asked him what it was for, and he said it was the last lock on the last door. She reached beneath the lower edge of the panel, found the recessed keypad on the inner face of the frame, and entered 4 digits. The panel released. It opened on a shallow hinge, smooth and unhurried, revealing a foam-lined space, roughly the size of a hardcover book. Inside a USB drive in a small plastic case, 2 sealed envelopes, and a handheld digital recorder with a label on the back in Arthur's handwriting. For Eleanor and Nora. Nora lifted the recorder out and held it toward me. I took it, pressed play, and Arthur's voice came into the room. He sounded like himself, the Arthur of 10 years ago, clear and deliberate, the voice of a man who had decided to say something important and was going to say it right. Ellie. If you're hearing this, you found it, which means something went wrong and you've been doing what you always do, figuring it out quietly until you have enough to act on. A pause, his breathing steady and familiar. I want to tell you 3 things. First, the trust I set up for Vincent 12 years ago, $3 million discretionary in his name alone. He drew it down completely by the time he was 31. He knows there's nothing left. What he wants now is not what I failed to give him. It is what I gave you. Second, the woman he married. I hired someone to look into her background 18 months ago. What I found points toward a pattern: a man in Arizona named Harold Marsh, a family that never got justice. The documentation is on the drive. Give it to Daniel. Give it to whoever needs it. He paused again, longer this time. Third, if Vincent has come back and if Celeste is with him, then I was right about what they intended. And I need you to know I built every wall I could before I left. Daniel knows his part. Elias has done his. The rest is yours, Ellie. It has always been yours. The recorder clicked off at 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The room was quiet. Nora was sitting on the floor beside the piano, her back against the cabinet. She was not crying. She was looking at the space above the keyboard with the expression of someone who has just heard their father's voice for the first time in months and is deciding where to put it. He knew all of it, she said. He knew all of it. I agreed. I held the recorder and looked at the open compartment. The USB, the envelopes, everything Arthur had sealed inside this instrument and left for us to find when we were ready. Tomorrow I would bring it to Daniel. Tomorrow the people who had been waiting in their separate positions would finally sit in the same room and understand the full shape of what we had. Tonight I sat on the floor beside my daughter with the recorder in my lap, the piano open above us, and the particular silence of a room where something long held has finally been released. Daniel's office held 6 people comfortably and 7 if no one moved their chair. We were 7. Eleanor, Nora, Daniel, Helena, Miriam, Elias, and Arthur, in the form of a small digital recorder, placed at the center of the conference table, like the 7th seat at a table set for a guest who would not be arriving in person. I'd called everyone the night before. No explanation beyond come to Daniel's office at 9. Bring nothing. I'll explain when you're here. They had all come without asking why, which told me something about the particular loyalty that forms between people who have been through something difficult together, even when they have been going through it in separate rooms. Daniel reviewed the USB contents first. The drive held 4 folders, financial records documenting the $3 million trust and Vincent's full withdrawal history. The private investigator's report on Celeste cross-referenced with the Harold Marsh timeline in Arizona, a scanned copy of Arthur's handwritten notes from the 18 months before his death, and a folder labeled simply, "For the court if needed." Helena leaned forward when Daniel opened the investigator's report. This ties Celeste directly to Marsh's estate transfers. Circumstantially, yes, Daniel said. Combined with Lydia Voss's account, it becomes significantly more than circumstantial. Then I played the recorder. Arthur's voice in that office was different from Arthur's voice in the music room the night before. In the music room, it had been intimate, a husband speaking to a wife in the dark. Here, in the flat morning light with 6 people around a conference table, it was something else. It was a man who had understood exactly what he was doing and had done it carefully and completely the way he did everything. The room stayed quiet through all 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When it ended, Daniel said, "This is admissible." a recorded personal statement made by the decedent in sound mind addressing his estate and the individuals named in his will. I can authenticate the recording through the metadata on the file and cross-reference the date with Arthur's medical records showing full cognitive capacity at the time of recording. Helena exhaled slowly. "Arthur, you meticulous, impossible man." Miriam said nothing. She was looking at the recorder with the expression she reserved for things that moved her and that she had decided not to cry about. Elias sat with his hands folded on the table. He had heard Arthur's voice before, had worked alongside him in the music room for years, but hearing it in this context, in this room, with this purpose, seemed to require a moment of private adjustment. He took it quietly and without explanation, and no one asked him to account for it. I looked around the table at these people. A retired principal, a physician, a piano tuner, a lawyer, my daughter, all of them here, because Arthur had trusted the right people and I had found them in the right order. "What do we need before the hearing?" I asked. Daniel straightened his papers. "We have the recording, the USB documentation, Helena's lab report, June's camera footage, and Noah's video. That is a substantial package." He paused. "What would make it complete is Lydia Voss on record." "She's close," I said. "I know she is." Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and his expression shifted the particular stillness of a man receiving information he'd been half expecting and hoping would not arrive yet. "Vincent filed an amended motion this morning," he said. "Emergency acceleration. He's claiming your condition has deteriorated and that the delay poses immediate financial risk to the estate." He set the phone down. "The hearing has been moved to next week, Eleanor." Next week. I looked at the recorder on the table, at the USB beside it, at the faces around the room, steady, prepared, ready. "Then we need Lydia today," I said. Vale picked me up at 10. He had called 20 minutes after I left Daniel's office, already one step ahead, the way good investigators always are. "If we're going to Lydia Voss today," he said, "I should come with you. She'll respond differently to a badge than she will to a knock on the door." He was right. When Lydia opened her apartment door and saw Vale standing beside me, something shifted in her face. Not fear, but the particular recalibration of a person who has been waiting for someone official to show up and had begun to suspect no one ever would. "Come in," she said. Vale explained the investigation in plain language. The LLC, the financial transfers, the connection to Arizona. He told Lydia that what she knew could help establish a pattern across 2 states and that the Savannah DA's office was prepared to pursue charges if the evidence supported it. "Can she come after me if I talk?" Lydia asked. She was looking at Vale, not at me. "We're past the point where she has the leverage to do that," Vale said. "She's about to have significantly larger problems." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Harold deserved better than what he got. His family deserved better." She looked at her hands. "I've been carrying this for 4 years. I'm tired of carrying it." She gave her statement to Vale that afternoon, formal recorded witnessed. Every detail of Harold Marsh of Celeste's methods of the folder she had described to me weeks earlier. Vale told her he would seek a search warrant for the Hale property based on the totality of evidence now assembled. The hearing was 3 days later. Chatham County Probate Court on Wright Square. A room that smelled like old paper and central air conditioning with pale wood paneling and a Georgia state seal on the wall behind the judge's bench. I sat beside Daniel at the respondents' table. Nora sat directly behind me. Across the aisle, Vincent and Celeste arrived together, Vincent in a dark suit, Celeste in gray. She did not look at me when she sat down. Daniel presented the counter evidence methodically, the way he did everything without theater, without pause, each piece placed before the court in logical sequence. Helena's lab report on the medication, June's camera footage authenticated and time-stamped, Noah's video submitted with a supporting declaration confirming the circumstances of the recording, Arthur's recorded statement authenticated through metadata and medical records establishing his cognitive capacity at the time. The trust documentation confirming Vincent had received and depleted $3 million prior to Arthur's death. Then Daniel called Lydia Voss, whose formal recorded statement had already been submitted to the court. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and spoke for 11 minutes. She did not look at Celeste once. She did not need to. When Daniel finished, Vincent's attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. The ruling came 40 minutes later. The guardianship petition was denied in full. The probate court found insufficient evidence of cognitive decline and substantial evidence of deliberate interference with the petitioner's medication and documentation. The family trust was reaffirmed and placed under protective order pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The court referred the matter to the Chatham County DA's office for review of potential criminal charges, including elder abuse fraud and tampering with medication. Vincent stood when the ruling was read. He didn't say anything. He looked at me across the aisle with an expression I could not fully read, something between fury and a recognition that the ground he had been standing on for months had simply ceased to exist. Celeste was already looking at her attorney. Outside the courthouse afterward, Vale fell into step beside me on the marble steps. "Search warrant came through an hour ago," he said. "We executed it this morning while you were in there. We found a folder at the Hale residence." He paused. "Eleanor. There are names in it. More than Harold Marsh. At least 3 others." I stopped on the steps and looked out over Wright Square, the fountain, the oak trees, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside that building. "What happens now?" I asked. Now Vale said it becomes a federal matter. 4 months had passed since the courthouse steps. The investigation had moved the way federal investigations move deliberately out of public view with the particular patience of a process that does not hurry for anyone. Vale had called twice with brief updates. The folder, the names, the pattern spreading across 4 states, not 3. I had learned to wait without anxiety, which was perhaps the most useful thing the last 9 months had taught me. The memorial concert had been planned before any of this began a November evening at the church where Arthur had worshipped for 30 years, where Father Brennan had listened to his fears and kept his confidences and held a letter for a woman he had never met. The Steinway had been transported from Abercorn Street that afternoon, which had required 3 men, 2 moving blankets, and 45 minutes of careful maneuvering through the church's side entrance. I had not told Vincent and Celeste about the evening. I had not needed to. The notice had run in the Savannah Morning News the previous Sunday the way memorial announcements do in a city where people still read the paper. They arrived at 7:15 just as the pews were filling. Celeste in black, Vincent with his hand at her back. Neither of them saw me watching from the side vestibule. I took my seat at the Steinway at 7:30. The church was full former students, colleagues from the music academy, neighbors, people who had bought instruments from Arthur's restoration shop over 30 years and wanted somewhere to put their gratitude. Miriam sat in the front pew, Nora beside her, Daniel at the end of the row, Elias 3 rows back, his tool case on the floor beside his feet. I began to play. Arthur's unfinished piece started quietly, the same 8-note sequence, from the combination now woven into something longer and more complex that he had been building for the last year of his life. I had found the manuscript tucked inside the bench seat 3 days after we opened the compartment in a manila folder with no label, the way Arthur filed things he considered unfinished and therefore not yet ready to be named. I had spent 4 months learning it, not performing it, but learning it the way you learn a language, sitting with each phrase until it stopped feeling like someone else's sentence. His handwriting filled the margins, tempo arrows, the word breathe, written 3 times, and a note in the corner of the 3rd page that said simply, "This is the hard part," with no further explanation, entirely characteristic of him. The piece was his and mine both, now the way certain things become shared property without either party formally agreeing to it. Halfway through, I stopped. The church went very still. Arthur wrote this as a message. I said, my voice carrying in the acoustics of the old stone space. He wrote it knowing he might not be here to finish it. Tonight, I want you to hear what it meant. I nodded to Elias. He stood cross to the Steinway and crouched before the lower panel. In the silence of the church with 200 people watching, he played the 8-note sequence on the keys, as I had shown him, and the compartment opened with the same soft, deliberate sound it had made in the music room on a June night 4 months ago. He lifted the USB from the foam lining and handed it to Daniel, who was already standing. Daniel addressed the room in 3 sentences: what the drive contained, what it proved, what it meant for the estate and the people who had tried to take it. At the back of the church, I saw Vale move. He and a colleague approached the pew where Vincent and Celeste were seated. There were no raised voices, no visible disturbance, just 2 federal investigators and a quiet but unambiguous request that could not be declined. Vincent stood without looking around. Celeste picked up her bag with the same composed precision she brought to everything, and I thought even now she is performing. They walked out through the side door. I turned back to the keyboard and played the final movement, the pages I had written myself, the notes Arthur had not reached. When the last chord resolved and faded into the stone walls of the church, the silence lasted long enough to mean something. Father Brennan found me afterward in the vestibule, the crowd thinning around us. "He would have been so proud of you," he said. I looked out through the open church doors at the November night, the oak trees on the street, the distant sound of the river Savannah, dark and familiar and unchanged. "He gave me everything I needed," I said. "I just had to find it." I stood there a moment longer, the night air cool on my face, knowing there was still one thing left to do. December came to Savannah the way it always does, gently, without apology, the air turning cool enough to mean something without ever quite committing to cold. By the first week of the month, the legal picture had clarified enough for Daniel to summarize it in a single phone call. Vincent had been indicted on federal charges of financial fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Celeste faced additional charges across 3 jurisdictions connected to the names in the folder Vale had found at the Hale residence. Neither of them was going anywhere. The family trust was protected, the estate intact, the house on Abercorn Street still mine in every sense that mattered. Daniel said Arthur built it to hold. It held. I thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in my hand, listening to the house around me. It sounded different than it had in February, not emptier, but cleaner, like a room after the windows have been opened. I called Nora. I called Miriam. I did not call anyone else because some mornings belong only to the people who were there for the hardest parts. The scholarship program had been announced the week before through the Savannah music community, the Arthur Whitmore Foundation for Music and the Arts offering annual awards to students from underserved households across Chatham County. The applications would open in January. I had spent 3 evenings writing the eligibility criteria myself because Arthur had always said that the most important decisions deserve the most personal attention. Noah came for his lesson on a Thursday afternoon, the last one before the holiday break. He had been accepted to the Schwab School of Music at Columbus State University, beginning the following fall. He had told me 2 weeks ago, with the careful understatement of someone who was not yet sure he was allowed to be as happy as he felt. I had told him he was absolutely allowed. He played the full Chopin Nocturne. From memory that afternoon, both hands beginning to end without stopping once. When he finished, he sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the keys. "You're ready," I said. He looked up. "For what?" "For whatever comes next." After he left, I sat alone in the music room as the December light went low and amber through the plantation shutters. The grand piano was back in its place, returned from the church. 3 weeks ago, the hidden compartment now permanently open, the foam lining removed, the small space inside empty and visible. Arthur's secret no longer a secret, just a part of the instrument's history now, the way all the best secrets eventually become stories. I picked up Arthur's manuscript from the music stand, the full score, his pages and mine together, pencil and ink mixed across the staff lines in 2 different hands. I placed it on the stand and sat down. I played from the beginning, the 8 opening notes that had been a lock and were now simply music. The development he had written through a year of quiet evenings in this room. The passages I had added in the months after learning what he had intended by living inside what he had left. And then the final page entirely mine, written in the particular silence of a December evening, when I had finally understood that finishing something is not the same as letting it go. The last chord faded into the room, and I sat with my hands resting on the keys, the way Arthur used to sit after he played, not immediately lifting them, giving the sound a moment to finish existing before the silence took over. Outside, the Christmas lights on Abercorn Street were coming on one by one in the early dark. Inside, the music room held the particular warmth of a place where something important had happened and had not been forgotten. Arthur always said a piece of music is never truly finished. It simply waits for the right hands. I finally understood what he meant. Looking back now, I think the most dangerous thing I did was wait. Not the waiting itself, sometimes. Waiting is wisdom. But I waited while telling myself that what I was seeing could not possibly be what it was. I waited because I felt guilty, because I wanted to be fair, because I believed that a woman my age, in my position, should find a way to make peace with difficult people rather than fight them. Don't do what I did. If something feels wrong in your family, in your home, in the people who are supposed to love you, trust that feeling. Document it. Ask for help before you think you need it. The people who want to take from you are counting on your silence. Don't give it to them. I have thought often about what Arthur left behind, not the house, not the trust, not the evidence carefully sealed inside an old piano. I mean the faith he had in me. He did not call me fragile. He did not try to solve it for me. He simply built the tools and believed I would find them. I believe that kind of love, the kind that prepares you rather than protects you, is one of the greatest gifts one person can give another. And I believe in the quiet of the music room on a December evening that God had a hand in, making sure I found my way through. If this story moved you, if any part of Eleanor's journey felt familiar, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who might need it. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. One last thing, the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and understanding. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.